So no one likes a braggart. And yet in our narcissistic society today, we are surrounded by them. I went to Google this week and typed in famous braggarts and got quite a few options. There are the obvious ones, Ron Burgundy, Muhammad Ali, but there are other ones as well. Kanye West, for example, the famous hip-hop artist, he once said this: "For me, I'm a creative genius. There's no other way to word it." I think if he had thought a little bit more, there would be other ways to word it. Similarly, Justin Bieber tells us, "Don't say I'm not talented. If you haven't noticed, I wasn't made, I was found." I actually hadn't noticed, but it's not just contemporary musicians who brag about how awesome they are. John Lennon once said of the Beatles, "Christianity will go, it will vanish and shrink. We're more popular than Jesus now." He's also much more dead. And it's not just musicians either. After his military leadership proved decisive in World War II, General Patton went on the record, "My actions are the most brilliant operation we have thus far performed, and it is, in my opinion, the outstanding achievement of the war." Well, and of course, President Trump is a very confident individual. He once said, "I know more about ISIS than the generals do. Believe me." Okay. And he also said, "I'm very highly educated. I know words. I have the best words." The best words. No one likes a braggart. Neither, for that matter, does God. In the Bible, God has some very harsh words for braggarts. He has some very harsh words for people who think a little too highly of themselves. And unfortunately for us, his words might apply to us, do apply to us as much as they do apply to anybody. We find God's stern words in Paul's letter to the Romans. As Jeremy said, we're studying Paul's letter to the Romans here at Rooftop in an extended study. The series that we're in right now, it's called Face the Wrath. Paul, if you don't know, was a first-century Christian missionary and an eyewitness of the resurrected Jesus. He wrote a big, long letter to the Christian church in Rome in which he summarizes the good news of Christianity, the good news of Jesus' crucifixion on the cross for our sins, and the good news of his resurrection from the dead. But in order for Paul to get to the good news of the gospel of Christianity, he has to first wade through some bad news. What's the bad news? The bad news is that we are all sinners in trouble with God. We are all spiritual criminals, if you will, deserving of God's judgment, his wrath. So with that introduction, let me go ahead and read to you the passage that we're going to study together this morning. It is Romans chapter 2, verses 17 through 24. "Now you, if you call yourself a Jew, if you rely on the law and boast in God, if you know his will and approve of what is superior because you are instructed by the law, if you are convinced that you are a guide for the blind, a light for those who are in the dark, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of little children, because you have in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth, you then who teach others, do you not teach yourself? You who preach against stealing, do you steal? You who say that people should not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who boast in the law, do you dishonor God by breaking the law? As it is written, God's name is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. Now, as I mentioned, this passage takes place in what we might call the bad news section of Romans. In this section of the letter, Paul is systematically addressing every segment of humanity. He is explaining to them, to us, to you, that we are all sinners in need of God's mercy. This is true of pagan idolaters, it's true of moralistic hypocrites, and it's true also of Paul's people, the Jews. Paul was a Jew. He was a member of the nation of Israel. He was a descendant of the Israelite father Abraham. But even still, despite that, Paul knows that in terms of pleasing God, in terms of satisfying God's righteous expectations, his people aren't much better off than the rest of humanity. His people, Israel, needs Jesus as much as anybody does. That is, in general, the point of this section of Romans. But let's look at it a little bit more closely. We can actually divide this section up into 3 segments. In verses 17 through 20, for example, Paul describes a special calling for the nation of Israel. In the second section, verses 21 through 23, Paul describes a striking contradiction concerning this special calling. And in the final segment, the last verse, verse 24, Paul mentions an unfortunate consequence. So special calling, striking contradiction, unfortunate consequence. Let's look at each one of those real briefly. Starting with the first, verses 17 through 20, the special calling. As Paul writes in that section, now you, if you call yourself a Jew, if you rely on the law and boast in God, if you know his will and approve of what is superior because you are instructed by the law, if you are convinced that you are a guide for the blind, a light for those who are in the dark, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of little children, because you have in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth. Now here the apostle describes what is supposed to be true of Israel. Centuries before Paul ever wrote this letter, God could tell that humanity had gotten off the rails. Humanity had become a big mess of immorality and spiritual emptiness. But God had a plan. God had a plan to redeem, rescue humanity. God would select out of the nations, out of humanity, one nation to bless the other nations. Now, this one nation wouldn't be a particularly impressive nation. This one nation wouldn't be a large nation. In fact, just the opposite. This nation might be a small, puny, unimpressive nation, but this would be by design, right? So that this one nation would have no reason to boast. So that the rest of the world would see what God could do through this one tiny, puny little nation. Now, of course, I'm talking about the nation of Israel, the nation of the Jews, Paul's people. When God picked Abraham, the father of the Jews, the plan was to turn them into a holy people, a God-fearing people, a law-abiding people that would bless all the peoples of the earth. This is actually what God told Abraham in the Old Testament when he pulled him out of the nations. He said, I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. All the peoples of the earth will be blessed through you. That would be their calling. And that's actually what Paul describes here in this section of the text. God gives Israel the revelation of his will so that they would be a guide to the nations, so that they would instruct the foolish, so that they would teach the children, so that they would enlighten those trapped in darkness. That was their special calling. But you probably know how the story unfolds. Israel had lots of trouble living up to their special calling, which brings us to the second part of the passage. Paul describes the striking contradiction between Israel's calling and the reality of their situation. As he asks, you then, who teach others, do you not teach yourself? You who preach against stealing, do you steal? You who say that people should not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who boast in the law, do you dishonor God by breaking the law? So despite the eternally important role that God had assigned to them, for the most part, Israel, shall we say, struggled with their divine calling. This is, in a sense, the story of the Old Testament. You read the story of the Old Testament and you read a story about a nation struggling to keep their sacred calling. The nation of Israel gave in to paganism and idolatry. They broke all the laws that they were supposed to be keeping. They even let their nation fall into a civil war, a very violent civil war. They split up in two, and each half of the nation was carried off into exile into other nations. In a word, Israel became a nation of hypocrites. And this resulted in, finally, an unfortunate consequence, the third part of the passage. As Paul writes, "As it is written, God's name is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you." To put this another way, the Gentiles are the non-Jews. That's what the word Gentile means. It's a non-Jew. They ignore and hate the Israelite God because of the Israelites. Here, Paul quotes a couple Old Testament prophets, and his point is that as a result of Israel's hypocrisy, nobody believes in their God. I mean, non-Israelites despise the Israelite God. And if you think about it, why wouldn't they? According to Paul, the nation of Israel had been overrun by hypocrisy and immorality. Why would anybody believe in the God that they believed in? I mean, imagine if Rooftop was filled with self-righteous hypocrites, judgmental hypocrites who routinely break the law, steal from our neighbors, and commit all kinds of evil deeds. And yet we have the audacity of proclaiming to the surrounding community that they still must believe in the God we worship. They wouldn't have any interest in doing that. They would have no interest in believing in our God. Why would I want to believe in your God if your God turns you into those types of people? They would think. I would rather jump from the roof than worship the God of the rooftoppers, they might think. That's what had become of Israel's sacred calling. God had given them a calling to serve and bless the nations. Now, whatever success Israel had had in executing that calling had been overwhelmed by the contradiction of their hypocrisy, and as a consequence, the Gentiles had no interest in their God at all. Now, how does this happen? How can a nation so clearly called by God give up that calling and give in to immorality and hypocrisy? Well, I think Paul actually gives us a clue in the passage with his repeated reference to the boasting of the Jews. As he writes in verse 17, "Now you, if you call yourself a Jew, if you rely on the law and boast in God." And as he writes in verse 23, "You who boast in the law, do you dishonor God by breaking the law?" The Greek word for boast there, the New Testament was written in Greek, and the Greek word for boast there is maybe better translated in this section, maybe better translated as brag. To brag means to get cocky and to tell people how awesome you are. According to Paul, Israel had gotten cocky. They were bragging about how special they were. In the words of Kanye West, they were creative geniuses. They weren't made, they were found. They have all the best words. They had forgotten what I said earlier, that God did not give them their sacred calling because they were large and impressive. God chose them precisely because of the opposite. God chose this puny little nation to draw attention to his power and love, not their own qualifications. Many in Israel had forgotten that. They thought they had earned their special status, so they started bragging. And God removed his blessing from them as a people because, as I said, nobody, including and especially God, likes a braggart. This is what happens to braggarts. This is what happens to people who let their success go to their heads. They forget that if there is anything special or sacred about them, it's not something that they've earned, but something that they were given. When I read this passage about Israel, for example, I think of America. I think of our nation. Think about it. America was founded with a special calling. When the Puritans first colonized America, they did so with a sense of divine purpose. In his founding speech to the original settlers in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, Puritan John Winthrop casts a vision that this new colony will be the new Israel. As he said, "We must consider that we shall be as a city on a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us." Even the founders of our republic, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Believe that we would be a shining democratic light to the nations. We would be a destination for the tired, the hungry, and the poor masses yearning to be free. And maybe for a while we were kind of that. I mean, we've certainly had our shining moments. Like when we rescued the world from fascism in World War II, like when we protected the world from global communism in the Cold War. I mean, thank you, veterans, by the way. But eventually, the same thing that happened to Israel happened to America. We got cocky. We started chanting and believing things like we're number one. We started believing that we were the greatest country in the world because we made ourselves so. We forgot that nothing we have achieved has taken place without the providence and the blessing of God. We forgot that we did not earn this great land. Heck, we weren't even given this great land. We stole it from its original inhabitants. We got cocky. And our once strong nation has turned into a nation of, forgive me, fat and lazy hypocrites. I mean, I'm as proud to be an American as Lee Greenwood. But our veterans gave their lives for something greater than this. And aside from the idealism of our Constitution and our performance at the Olympics, does our nation really stand out that much more anymore? We have given up our calling and become a contradiction, and now we bear the consequences of that. Because of our boastful hypocrisy, people laugh at our ideals. People roll their eyes at Americans. The nations do not listen to us. We gave up our special calling. We gave up our moral authority decades ago. When I read this passage about Israel, I think about America. But I don't just think about America. I also think about, far more importantly, the Christian church. Now, over the centuries, to be sure, and you've probably been wondering this, over the centuries, Paul has actually been accused of anti-Semitism or hatred of the Jews, because even here in this passage, he speaks so critically of his own people. But what these critics fail to notice is that Paul isn't anti-Jewish, but sort of anti-everybody. He's like anti-hypocrisy. His words are as much for Christian hypocrites as they are for Jewish hypocrites. In fact, just change the word Jews to Christians in this passage or in the New Testament at all, and the passage works just as well. As Paul says, now you, if you call yourself a Christian, if you rely on the law and boast in God, you then who teach others, do you not teach yourself? You who preach against stealing, do you steal? As it is written, God's name is blasphemed amongst the Gentiles because of you Christians. It's not just Israel and America that can get cocky, it's us. It's the Christian church. We have a special calling from God to be the light of the world. I mean, that's what Jesus sent us into the world to do. You are the light of the world. So let your light so shine before men that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven. That's our special calling. But we have contradicted it with the hypocrisy of our lives. I mean, think of what Christians have been guilty of over the years. The Crusades, the Spanish Inquisition, the spread of slavery, the persecution of Jews, the defense of racism and xenophobia, the subjugation of women, discrimination of homosexuals, the mega wealth of hypocritical televangelists. And I haven't even gotten to your life or mine yet. Consider our own immorality. Did you know that the divorce rate amongst Christians is the same as that amongst non-Christians? We contradict our special calling. You and I can be as corrupt as our godless pagan neighbors, and there are consequences to that. There are non-Christians in the world, non-Christians in our lives, we all know them, who refuse to worship Jesus because they look at the church and they think, why would I want to go and worship there? Why would I want to worship the God of the Christians? God's name is blasphemed among the pagans because of us, because of me, because of you. Now, you might actually think I'm being kind of hard on the Christian church. I mean, we're not all that bad, right? Sure, the church is filled with some really rotten apples, but we're not all evil. I mean, there are some really wonderful saints in the church. Even here at Rooftop, we're a good church filled with good people. We've got saints among us, people like Aaron Schrage and, Cindy Mills and Chris Schubert and Justin Stone. And that's probably about it, Maybe a few others. We've got some great people around here. We serve the homeless and we help run the food pantry. We teach hundreds of kids about Jesus every Sunday morning. So we're not all that bad. But compared to God's perfect holy righteousness, we really are. Compared to God's perfect holy righteousness, we really are that bad. I mean, any moral improvement that we've made over, let's say, the Salem witch trials, any moral improvement that we've made over the Salem witch trials is negligible compared to God's perfect moral righteousness. Furthermore, anything good we've ever done in the history of the church has nothing to do with us and everything to do with Him. And this, I think, is actually the key. If the mistake that Israel and America made was getting cocky and bragging about our special status, the antidote, the solution is humility. The opposite to cockiness, to bragging, is humility. Humility is acknowledging to God that we are nothing without Him. In fact, that's actually what the word humble means. It comes from the Latin root humus, which means earth or dirt. To be humble is to plant your face in the dirt, because that is where you belong compared to the righteousness of God. It's why when saints in the Bible encounter God, what do? They fall prostrate as fast as they possibly can to get their face in the dirt, because that's where they belong compared to the righteousness of God. Humility is the only way that we can stay true to our special calling. As James writes in the New Testament, God opposes the proud. God can't stand braggarts. God opposes the proud, but favors the humble. Now, how do we stay humble? How do we stay humble where Israel and America didn't? This is the challenge. This is the question. And it's important not just for us as Christians, but for us as Rooftopers. I mean, I don't know if you realize this, but Rooftop's really cooking. We're baptizing lots of people every month. On some Sundays, we're actually having trouble finding open seats for visitors. We're getting tons of visitors. Beating our budget. Our ministries are busting at the seams. Youth group, small groups. We're sending thousands of dollars to missions and ministries around the world. We're developing a wonderful reputation in the city as a healthy, life-changing, spirit-filled church. We're like Israel and America on the precipice of greatness. How do we not come crashing down? This is when it happens, right? This is when it all falls apart. As Paul warned the Corinthians, if you think you are standing firm, be careful lest you fall. So again, how do we stay humble? Well, we have to remember what Israel and America did not. We have to remember that God did not give us a special calling because of anything having to do with us. Nothing we are, nothing we have done has anything to do with us. Christianity is not the largest, fastest growing religion in the world because of anything that we're doing well. We are not going to heaven because of the impressive nature or quality of our lives. No, just the opposite. God chose us precisely because we are so ill-qualified. God chose us so that He could show His glory to the world by demonstrating what He can do in His power through the lives of complete, immoral, hypocritical losers like us. It's like Paul tells the Corinthians, brothers and sisters, think about what you were when you were called. Think about it. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were influential. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the strong. God chose the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. God chose the lowly things of the world and the despised things and the things that are not to shame the things that are, so that no one may boast before God. It is because of him that you are in Christ Jesus. Therefore, let him who boasts, let him who brags, brag in this. Brag in the Lord. If we're going to brag, if we're going to be so bold, let's brag on that. That we are in Christ. That's what we need to remember, that we are nothing without God. We forget that at our peril. I have a sign up on my bulletin board in my office that I put up there years ago to remind me of this. The sign says this: never forget, you are one stupid mistake away from total self-destruction. Right there by my head. Don't forget that. Never forget, you are one stupid mistake away from total self-destruction. And I believe that because it is true. One stupid mistake, my life, my family, my ministry, gone. That's true for me. That's true for you. One stupid mistake, your life, your family, your profession, your ministry, gone. It actually hangs right next to a story that I printed out from the internet. A true story, a news story of a pastor acquaintance / buddy of mine named Todd. Todd was a pastor of a great church out in North Carolina in the 90s. This church was the stuff. They were getting all the news headlines, national news headlines, all the people, real cutting edge place, growing super fast. Todd, a friend, couldn't keep up with it. Started overworking, trying to keep up, developed a substance abuse problem, had an affair, became erratic and violent, attacked some congregants, physically attacked his wife, ended up in prison. Todd forgot that he was always only one stupid mistake away from total self-destruction. He made several. Now his life, his family, his church is destroyed. Now, thankfully, Todd's on the mend. Jesus is rebuilding his life, and Jesus is actually doing some pretty cool things through Todd's rebuilt life. Jesus can do that. He can rebuild anybody's life, including yours. If you got cocky and you made a stupid mistake, Jesus can rebuild your life too. But better to avoid that, because that's what happens. It's what happened to Israel, to America, to Todd. Our calling becomes a contradiction, leading to a consequence. Let's not let it happen to us. Let's not forget that we are nothing without Jesus. Our calling as God's people, our mission to serve our families and